Hello, everyone, and welcome back for another episode of the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. This is your host, Howard Fox. The Outdoor Adventure Series celebrates individuals and families, businesses, and organizations that seek out and promote the exploration, stewardship, conservation, access, and enjoyment of the great outdoors. Our guest today is Steve Ramirez. Steve is an outdoor enthusiast, an author, naturalist, and educator. He has always seen his life as a quest that is driven by a search for meaning and a desire to make a positive contribution to humanity and the natural world. Steve is also the author of a number of books, his first being Casting Forward, Fishing Tales from the Texas Hill Country, that was published back in 2020. His most recent book, published actually 2 months ago, technically, back in May, is the wonderful book, Casting Onward, Fishing Adventures in Search of America's Native Gamefish. And I have reason to believe he's now working on his third book, and we'll let him share a little bit more about that. But without further ado, Steve, it's a pleasure to finally get connected with you here on the podcast. Thanks for joining us today.
The pleasure really is mine. You and I had to work hard to get our schedules together, and I really appreciate how we brought it all together. Thank you.
I feel like this was like trying to go on a first date with somebody. It's like, where should we go? Where should we meet? Again, I appreciate it. And for our listeners, I know Steve, as I know many of my guests of late, from the Outdoor Writers Association of America. Now, Steve and I have not met in person. We've met virtually. But this wonderful aspect of this organization, I get to meet guys just like Steve. And I'm excited today again to have you on the podcast, Outdoor Adventure. So much going on in this world, Steve, with the Supreme Court. I don't know what your politics are. You don't know what mine are, and we'll kind of leave it at that. But there was a huge environmental based decision made this week that it's like, oh my God. And here you are, you've got these wonderful books, and we're going to talk about that. But when I hear somebody say I'm a naturalist, an educator, conservationist, I think that's great. That's what we need. And so for our listeners, before we kind of really dive into the meat of this episode, share a little bit about your background with our listeners. So who is Steve Ramirez?
Well, I will. The first thing I want to do is touch on what you just said about the Supreme Court, and because it can be so disheartening when people like us care so much about the outdoors and about having a positive environment. And I used to be a college professor as well, and I taught public policy, among other things. And at one point, one of my students said, "It seems so hopeless. Why do we bother?" And I said, "Are you going to live forever?" And she said, "No." And I said, "Do you go to the doctor?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, why?" And she said, "To make life better than it would be otherwise, to do my part." And I said, "Well, there you go. That's what we're doing with everything." So in a nutshell, me giving you that feedback talks about who I am, which is service has always been important to me. And feeling like I think for me anyway, the only way we have meaning in our life is when we create it. There's been billions of people before me, and I don't remember their faces, and no one will remember mine. So it's what I can do. So that's who I am. I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a friend. I try to, as a former Marine, I'm bold, but I'm humble. I know that I don't really matter except for what I can do. And I love writing and the outdoors. So this is perfect. This
Okay.
is perfect.
When I hear someone, whether it's on the podcast, outside, bring up the word meaning, I'm always brought back to Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. And I
Yes.
haven't read it in a while, and I need to go back and read it because so much going on. And I think it's like the exchange you had with your student is somehow we have to have hope that we're going to leave this world in a better place. And for me, I mean, you have a family. I don't. My legacy in some shape or fashion are these podcast episodes, all 400 plus of them. Okay.
Mhm.
And I like to think that there is still hope out there, but sometimes, man, it's difficult. And y- you grew up I know in Florida and you ended up in Texas. Let's talk about kind of growing up, and again, the environment has changed considerably. I remember Florida when I was real young. All I can remember vividly is the smell in the morning of the moist air and the flowers, and it's like, what a cool place. So, what was it like growing up there and starting to get your outdoor legs, and what kind of activities were you involved with there that kind of laid the groundwork for a lot of things you're doing today?
That is such a great question. And by the way, I just came back from probably will be the last trip I take in my lifetime to my home country in Florida that I grew up in. As part of writing this third book, actually, I end it with me going back home. Well, the other home. So I lived most of my life in Texas. I've lived and traveled through 4 continents, but I did grow up in what I will call old Florida. I think you know what I mean. I grew up in northern Palm Beach County when there was only 40,000 residents in the entire county. There's probably about 3.5 million now.
Oh boy.
And back when there was still Florida panthers, and I remember finding their prints in the footprints I made as I hiked through the palmettos. I remember hearing them back when there was more alligators than people. And as a kid there, I spent all my time outdoors. In casting forward, I do openly talk about the fact that I have PTSD, and I use nature to deal with that. Uh, and that's not just from the Marines. It's not just from 30 years of dealing with bad guys. It's also from growing up being abused by one of my parents and loved by the other. So I tell you that story because nature in Florida is what saved me. I
Mhm,
ran out the door every chance I could. I watched birds. I climbed in trees. I did all the things kids used to do,
mhm.
running around out in the woods because back then we weren't worried about being abducted.
Right.
And it was normal for kids to run in the woods. And so I grew up in this perfect mixture of being on the edge of the Everglades and fishing with my cane pole in gator holes, and also spending many, many days and some nights out on the ocean in my dad's boat, the Triton. And we fished and snorkeled and scuba dived. And when we weren't out there, we were on the edge of the glades in the area of Loxahatchee. It was a wonderful place to grow up back then. I don't believe it's anywhere near the same now.
Right.
Everything does change. But I did see some things that were wonderful reminders when I was just there about a week ago.